I woke up to a ceiling full of fluorescent lights humming in a cold monotone above me, their glow slicing through the fog in my head as if someone had cracked open a door between two worlds. My vision steadied in slow pulses, each blink sharpening the outlines of the room until I recognized the sterile stillness of a hospital emergency department. The smell of antiseptic drifted through the air, clean and sharp, cutting through the faint taste of metal on my tongue. My heartbeat felt heavy and disoriented, thudding against my ribs, like it was trying to reorient itself inside my chest. For a moment, I could not tell what time it was, how long I had been unconscious, or even where I had been before this white room with its machines and faint beeping. I lay still, sinking into the stiff mattress beneath the thin hospital sheet, and tried to convince myself that this had to be a nightmare. But nightmares did not come with the sound of a Velcro blood pressure cuff tightening around your arm or the subtle click of a pin cap from someone standing just out of immediate focus. When I turned my head, the motion slow and dragging like it belonged to someone else, I saw him. A uniformed police officer was standing beside my bed, his posture rigid but not unfriendly. One hand resting near his duty belt as if instinct, not threat. His presence created a strange anchor in the chaos inside my mind. I stared at him, waiting for my memory to catch up to whatever moment had placed him here in this room with me. Across from him, near the foot of my bed, a man in a plain suit stood with a notebook, the kind of neutral attire detectives wear when they want to be unobtrusive but authoritative. He met my eyes for a fraction of a second, enough to acknowledge I was awake, then glanced down at his notes as if giving me space to orient myself. A nurse leaned over me. Her voice softened in the practiced way people use when they are afraid the truth might overwhelm someone who has just returned to consciousness. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "this is a mandatory report situation." The words slid into my ears like ice water. Mandatory report. My breath tightened. My body reacted before my memory did. Something inside me recoiled, shrinking into itself as if bracing against a blow I did not yet remember. The nurse checked the monitor beside me, then offered a small, reassuring smile, the kind that told me she had seen far too many women wake up the way I just had. "Take your time," she murmured. "You are safe." Safe. The word felt foreign, as if someone had handed it to me before I remembered how to hold it. The officer stepped slightly closer, not looming but steady, his expression a careful mix of professionalism and concern. "Miss, can you tell us the last thing you remember before you woke up here?" His voice was measured, holding back urgency as if he already suspected the answer. I swallowed the motion, scraping my throat dry. Images flickered behind my eyes, scattered and incomplete like pieces of film spliced together by someone with shaking hands. I saw white fabric moving around me. I saw flowers, bright lights, laughter, music, the soft clink of glass. Someone calling my name. A room full of people dressed beautifully. A wedding. My wedding. The memory came in a jolt, sharp enough to make me gasp. I felt the weight of my own wedding dress, the delicate lace sleeves, the fitted bodice I had chosen after months of planning. I remembered the way the skirt brushed the floor as I walked. I remembered smiling. I remembered joy that felt light and impossible to break. Weddings were supposed to be beginnings, not endings. The detective's voice floated toward me softer this time. "You were found unconscious at your venue. Paramedics brought you in." My chest tightened again, this time from a different kind of fear. I tried to lift my hand, but pain radiated through my arm, dull and deep, like a bruise forming beneath the skin. My head throbbed with a heavy pressure that made it hard to focus, and somewhere inside that haze, I sensed that the truth was sitting just beyond reach. Something had happened. Something violent. Something intentional. I closed my eyes, and another image rose to the surface. A corridor behind the reception hall. Dimmer lights, cooler air, the muffled thump of music behind a wall. A voice. A familiar voice. Male. Low. Angry. I felt my pulse spike, the monitor beside me chirping faster in response. The officer exchanged a glance with the detective, and the nurse laid a hand gently on my shoulder. "Do not rush it," she said, but everything in me was rushing. My mind was clawing at the edges of itself, desperate to fill in the missing pieces. I remembered turning. I remembered facing someone. I remembered the smell of alcohol on his breath. I remembered the heat of fury coming off him in waves, and I remembered his eyes. Eyes I had known my entire life. A tremor went through me, involuntary and sharp. The officer stepped closer. "Miss," he said carefully, "did someone hurt you?" The room held its breath with him. My own breath shook as the memory finally broke through the fog like a blade of its own. I felt again the sudden pressure against my side, the shock, the sting, the collapse of my legs. I felt the cold floor rushing up to meet me. I felt the world pulling away. I heard my own voice trying to form a word that never made it out. And I knew. The truth came with perfect clarity, cruel in its simplicity. My brother. It was my brother. My throat tightened as I whispered the words that had been waiting beneath consciousness. I did not know it yet, lying under those hospital lights, but the man who put me here was my own brother. The morning of my wedding began with a stillness that felt almost ceremonial, the kind of soft quiet that makes you think the universe is holding its breath just for you. I woke before my alarm, the pale Portland light slipping through the curtains of the bridal suite I had rented for the weekend. The room smelled faintly of lavender and fresh fabric from my dress hanging near the window, its white layers glowing in the early sun. For a little while, I let myself believe that the day would unfold exactly the way I had envisioned, gentle and uncomplicated, a celebration of everything I had built with the man waiting for me at the end of an aisle lined with flowers. I sat up slowly, letting the moment settle into my skin, but before I could fully inhabit the calm, a familiar knot tightened in my stomach. Weddings brought out many things in families, but in mine, they brought something else entirely. I reached for my phone on the nightstand and saw a text from my mother sent at 6:30 that morning. "Let us keep today peaceful. Please, no tension. Your brother wants everyone to have a good time." The words were dressed up as encouragement, but I knew what they really meant. Do not provoke Daniel. Do not correct him. Do not let his temper catch fire. Do not become the reason he explodes. I stared at the message until the letters blurred, reminded once again that even on my wedding day, my role in the family orbit had not changed. I was still the one responsible for keeping the peace. I set the phone down and exhaled slowly, trying to shake off the weight of childhood patterns creeping into a day that should have belonged to me. The hair and makeup team arrived at 8, bustling through the suite with curling irons and makeup cases filling the space with cheerful energy that I tried to absorb. They laughed, complimented my skin, asked about how I met my fiancé, and for a while their brightness softened the edges of my nerves. My maid of honor, Jenna, arrived soon after with iced coffee and a playlist of songs she claimed were scientifically engineered to raise serotonin. She danced around the room in her socks, trying to make me laugh, and it worked, because for a brief moment I forgot about the undercurrent waiting just beneath the surface. But the illusion broke when I heard a knock on the door, followed by my mother's hushed voice. "Claire." "Honey, your brother is here. He wants to check on logistics." Logistics? That was what Daniel always called it when he wanted control. I felt my shoulders tense even before he entered. He walked in without waiting for permission, wearing a suit he had chosen specifically to look more important than the groomsmen. His eyes swept the room in a way that felt more like inspection than admiration. He gave a quick nod, as if approving the setup before turning to me. "Big day," he said, but the tone carried no warmth. He asked about the schedule, the procession order, the seating, the catering arrival time, the alcohol distribution details that the coordinator had already handled. I answered cautiously, aware of the fragile balance, aware that anything could tip him into agitation. Jenna stiffened beside me, reading the shift in atmosphere, even though she had only met him a few times. Daniel strutted around the suite with the authority of someone who believed weddings were battlegrounds, and he was the commanding officer. At one point, he lifted my veil from the garment rack and held it up. "This is crooked," he muttered. "You should have steamed it again." I heard the makeup artist inhale sharply, but I gave her a small shake of my head. It was easier to let the comment slide than to confront him. Confrontation only fed the fire. He adjusted the veil as if proving a point and then placed it back with unnecessary force. When he finally left the room, my mother followed him whispering apologies I had come to recognize as her own survival tactic. As the door closed, Jenna turned to me with her eyebrows raised. "Is he always like that?" I forced a laugh. "Today is stressful for everyone." She gave me a look that said she did not believe a word of it. By noon, the venue was alive with movement. The florist was setting up the arch, the catering team was arranging the reception hall, and the photographer was capturing every detail from my shoes to the handwritten vows tucked inside a ribboned envelope. I moved through it all like someone floating between two realities, half bride and half mediator, aware of the joy surrounding me, yet always listening for the sound of Daniel's mood, shifting like weather. When he appeared again near the outdoor ceremony site, he was already holding a champagne flute, even though the bar was not supposed to open until after the ceremony. He grinned when he saw me, the kind of grin that did not reach his eyes. "I was just making sure everything looks right," he said. "Would not want your perfect day to get messed up." The words were sharp beneath the surface, but the guests milling around would never have known. On the outside, he was the charming older brother helping make the wedding run smoothly. Only I felt the tension coiling beneath his skin. The officiant called for the wedding party to line up, and as I took my place behind the bridesmaids, I tried to ground myself in the significance of the moment. "Today is about love," I whispered to myself. "Not about fear. Not about him." I listened to the music cue, the soft instrumental melody floating across the courtyard. My heart should have been racing with excitement, but all I felt was a strange quiet settling around me, the calm before something unnamed. I did not understand why until the ceremony ended and the celebration moved into its next phase. Only then would I learn that the peace I fought so hard to preserve was never mine to control, and that the storm I had spent my whole life trying to outrun had followed me straight into the happiest day of my life. I just did not know yet how dark it would become. Growing up, everyone said my brother Daniel was the protective one, the sibling who looked out for me, the boy who stood taller and louder so I would not have to. That was the story people liked to tell, the version that made family gatherings simpler and holidays less uncomfortable, the script that allowed my parents to pretend everything in our home was normal. But the truth was different, quieter, harder to explain. Daniel had never been protective. He had been territorial. There was a difference, and I learned it young. As children, when relatives praised his confidence, what they meant was that he filled every room like a storm front, commanding attention, bending conversations toward himself. When they told me how lucky I was to have a big brother who watched over me, they did not see the way his hand tightened on my shoulder a little too hard, or how he corrected me in public as if each word I spoke reflected on him. I learned to shrink early, to fold myself small so Daniel would not feel challenged by my existence. He was the golden child from the moment he took his first steps. People said he was charming, funny, gifted, misunderstood in the ways brilliant boys often are. Teachers excused his outbursts as passion. Coaches excused his aggression as competitive spirit. My parents excused everything. That is just how he is. He does not mean anything by it. He loves you. I heard those phrases so often they became a lullaby for denial. I think back now to how many times I swallowed hurt just to keep the peace. There were moments when we were teenagers that should have been warnings to the adults around us. The time he shoved me into the hallway wall because I wore his hoodie without asking. The time he forced me to apologize to him after he ruined my science project because, according to my father, I should not have left it on the dining table where he could knock it over. The time he snapped a bracelet my grandmother gave me because I would not let him borrow my laptop. Each incident was small enough to dismiss, but sharp enough to leave a mark on the person I was becoming. Daniel had a gift for making cruelty look like overreaction on my part. He would laugh after hurting me, ruffle my hair, tell me not to be dramatic. If I looked upset, he would roll his eyes and say I was sensitive, emotional, too quick to take things personally, and the adults in the room nodded along because it was easier to believe that narrative than confront the truth of who he was. I grew into a young woman with the same pattern burned into my bones. Keep your voice soft. Keep your requests minimal. Keep your joy contained so he would not resent your happiness. Even as adults, when I moved out and built a life of my own in Portland, Daniel's presence hovered like a shadow that arrived uninvited. He visited without warning, inserted himself into decisions he had no stake in, commented on my career, my apartment, my friends, as if I needed his approval before taking a breath. At family dinners, he teased me in ways that made others laugh and me feel small. He would tell a story about me mispronouncing a word at age 12, and everyone would chuckle, unaware of how his hand gripped my chair when I tried to protest. Even as an adult, I found myself defaulting to the same old script: shrink, de-escalate, yield. It was easier than the explosion that came with saying no. My parents loved us both, but they loved peace more than truth, and so Daniel's version of reality always won. If he was angry, it was because he cared. If he lashed out, it was because he was stressed. If he hurt me, it was because I provoked him even when I said nothing at all. The narrative followed us into adulthood, stitched into every interaction, until people outside the family believed it too. Daniel was the protective older brother. I was the emotional younger sister, a myth polished over years. My fiancé once said he admired how close Daniel and I were. I remember laughing, though, not because it was funny. I laughed because trying to explain the dynamic would require opening up the entire history of small wounds, unspoken rules, and quiet terrors. It would require admitting that my family had normalized harm so thoroughly that even I sometimes doubted my own perception of it. When I announced I was getting married, Daniel made himself the center of the story. He told me which venue was worth the money, which photographer was overrated, which menu items would embarrass us, and every time I tried to push back, he framed it as brotherly guidance. "I am just trying to help you. You would screw this up without me. You know you need someone to keep things in line." At my bridal shower, he pulled me aside and said he hoped I did not let marriage make me forget where I came from. I remember smiling tightly, unsure if it was a threat or a joke. Daniel spoke in statements that lived somewhere between the two, wrapped in humor sharp enough to draw blood if you were not careful. People always said he was joking. People always said I took things too seriously. People always said he loved me, and I guess in his own way, he thought he did. But his love came with ownership, with entitlement, with the belief that he knew who I should be better than I did. On my wedding day, watching him circle the venue like a guard dog claiming territory, I understood something I had never allowed myself to say out loud. Daniel did not want to protect me. Daniel wanted to control me. The difference was the size of an ocean. When he stood over me that morning with the veil in his hand, inspecting it for flaws, I felt the old fear rise like a whisper from childhood. Not fear of physical pain, though that too had existed in quiet ways over the years. It was fear of what he became when he felt he was losing influence. Fear of the look in his eyes when I made a decision without his input. Fear of the way his smile stretched thin whenever someone celebrated me. There was something in him that cracked open on days that were supposed to belong to me. Something resentful, simmering dangerous in ways no one else ever bothered to notice. Because Daniel was charming. Daniel was funny. Daniel was the golden child. And I was the one who learned to walk on eggshells so quietly it looked like grace. But standing there in my wedding dress, moments away from the ceremony, I could not shake the feeling that I had finally reached a line he never expected me to cross. A line that threatened the balance he had relied on for years. A line that once crossed would show me who he really was. I just did not know how violently he would make that truth known. The first warning came so quietly that if anyone else had been watching, they might have missed it entirely, brushed it off as pre-wedding nerves or harmless brother-sister teasing. But the shift in Daniel was so familiar to me that my stomach tightened before my brain even registered why. It started during the cocktail hour when the guests were settling into the glow of string lights and soft music, when everything about the evening felt warm and hopeful, like the world had paused long enough to let my life unfold gently. I had just stepped away from a cluster of friends when I noticed Daniel by the bar, his shoulders tense, his jaw set in a way I recognized from childhood, that grim line that meant the room was no longer big enough to contain whatever was churning inside him. I approached cautiously, telling myself he was just overwhelmed that a wedding could stir complicated emotions even in the best of families. But the truth rose like heat from the floorboards. He had been drinking steadily all afternoon, not enough to stumble, but enough that his edges had sharpened. His smile was a fraction too tight, his laughter delayed his movements a beat behind the music. When he finally turned toward me, the look in his eyes made me wish I had stayed across the room. There was an intensity there that did not match the celebration happening around us, a simmering resentment that seemed to flicker just behind the warmth he attempted to show. He leaned in, his breath tinged with whiskey, and said something I have not forgotten even now. "You think you are in control now." It was not loud, it was not dramatic, but the words nestled under my skin with the same cold weight they always had, the weight of a pattern I spent years pretending was not real. Before I could respond, a venue staff member approached him with a polite but firm request to keep his drink at the bar. She smiled kindly, explaining the house rule that alcohol could not be carried into certain areas. Daniel's reaction was immediate, a flash of irritation so quick anyone else might have mistaken it for confusion, but I knew the difference. His annoyance flared like a spark catching dry grass. He forced a chuckle, made a joke that did not quite land, and complied, but the tension in his shoulders did not ease. He felt corrected, and Daniel never handled correction well. The staff member walked away with a slight frown, glancing back at him, as if sensing something she could not name. She would later tell me she had an uneasy feeling, the kind she only got a few times a year, the kind she had learned not to dismiss. But in the moment, she simply returned to her duties, unaware that her brief interaction had struck the smallest nerve in a man who was already unraveling. As the evening moved on, I kept catching glimpses of Daniel hovering near conversations that had nothing to do with him, interjecting in ways that made guests shift uncomfortably. My fiancé tried to lighten the mood by steering him toward a group of cousins, but even from a distance, I could see the stiffness in Daniel's posture, the way he watched me as if I had taken something from him by simply being the one getting married. A strange heaviness settled over me, the kind that makes you take smaller breaths without realizing it. The joy of the day was still there, glowing and real, but there was a shadow stretching behind it, a quiet dread threading through the edges of the celebration. At one point, just before dinner, I slipped into the bridal suite to touch up my makeup and take a moment alone. My hands trembled slightly as I reapplied lipstick, and I told myself it was just adrenaline, just excitement. The knock on the door made me jump. When I opened it, Daniel stood there wearing a smile that did not reach his eyes. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. The air shifted immediately. He closed the door gently behind him, too gently, and for a moment, all the sounds of the wedding disappeared. "You didn't listen to me," he said. His tone was soft, almost conversational, but there was an edge beneath it that made the back of my neck prickle. About what I asked, though, I already suspected I would regret the question. About the seating plan, about the music, about everything. I tried to keep my voice steady, tried not to slip into the old patterns, but my pulse betrayed me. Daniel studied me as if searching for signs of defiance. He moved closer, invading my space in a way that made my chest tighten. I stepped back instinctively. That was when he smiled, a thin, knowing thing that froze me in place. "You think you have today under control. You do not." I wanted to call for help. I wanted to leave the room, but decades of conditioning held me still. Childhood habits have a way of persisting long after the danger becomes real. I finally managed to open my mouth, but before I could speak, my maid of honor knocked, calling my name. Daniel's expression shifted, smoothing out so quickly it made my stomach turn. He stepped back, straightened his suit, and walked out past her with a nod as though nothing had happened. She looked at me strangely, sensing something off, but I smiled and said I was fine, that everything was fine, because admitting the truth would require unraveling a family myth older than I was ready to confront. The rest of the evening unfolded with that same uneasy rhythm. Moments of pure happiness followed by undercurrents of threat joy, overshadowed by glances from Daniel that were too sharp, too assessing. I told myself it was just his mood, that weddings brought out strange emotions in siblings, but deep down, I felt the warning settle in my bones like a tremor before an earthquake. Something was coming. I could feel it in the way Daniel watched me. I could feel it in the way the lights seemed too bright, the music too loud, the air too still between us. And though I did not know it then, the first warning no one took seriously would be the last chance I had to recognize the moment when my wedding stopped being a celebration and became the beginning of a crime scene. The pattern did not begin at my wedding. It did not even begin in adulthood. It began long before I had language for fear, before I understood that what happened inside a home could shape the way a person learns to breathe, to react, to shrink. Growing up, Daniel's temper was not treated as a problem. It was treated as whether unpredictable but natural, something the rest of us were expected to work around. When he slammed doors so hard the frames shook, my mother called it passion. When he shoved me out of the way because I was standing too close to the television, my father called it sibling roughness. When Daniel snapped at teachers, broke a ceramic bowl, or threw a remote across the room, the adults would exchange those quiet glances that carried a dozen unspoken excuses. He is just emotional. He is overwhelmed. He is under pressure. Meanwhile, I learned the lesson he never had to stay small to stay safe. I learned to read the air the way some children learned to read books, scanning for the faintest shift in his mood, tightening my voice, my posture, my presence so he would not find a target. And when I did get hurt physically or emotionally, the explanation always fell on me. You know better than to antagonize him. You are the calm one. You are the reasonable one. Please help us keep the peace. The older I became, the more subtle the dynamic grew. Daniel did not always need outbursts to assert dominance. Sometimes it was a joke made at my expense, laced with a truth that revealed itself only to me. Sometimes it was the way he corrected my choices, undermining them with small comments that made me doubt myself. Sometimes it was the way my parents encouraged me to let things go because it was easier than challenging his reactions. By the time I left for college, I thought I had escaped the gravitational pull of my family's unspoken rules. I built a life with my own decisions, my own friendships, my own definitions of respect. But patterns are patient. They wait. They linger. And every holiday, every family gathering, every group photo we posed for brought me back into the orbit I wanted so badly to break. Even as an adult, Daniel's behavior slipped through the cracks of our family's excuses. At Thanksgiving 2 years ago, he grabbed me by the wrist during an argument, squeezing just a second too long, and when I pulled back in shock, he laughed as if I had misinterpreted everything. My mother later whispered that he did not mean anything by it. At a summer barbecue, he bumped into me hard enough that I spilled iced tea down my shirt. He apologized loudly, but smirked when no one else was looking. I convinced myself I was imagining things, that maybe I was too sensitive, that maybe I was reading threats where none existed. And then my engagement happened. Something shifted in him the moment I told the family. At first, he acted supportive, joking that I was finally joining the married adults club, but underneath, the humor was a tension I could not decipher. He made comments about the cost of the wedding, the location, the guest list. He insisted I was making decisions too quickly, that I needed guidance, that I was being naive. When I disagreed with him, even politely, he grew silent in a way that pulled oxygen from the room. My parents urged me to keep him involved so he would not feel excluded, a sentiment that ignored the years I had spent navigating his moods while they looked away. As the wedding approached, the pattern became harder to ignore. He sent long messages late at night dissecting logistical choices I had already finalized. He criticized my dress before I even tried it on, saying it did not look like something I would choose if I were thinking clearly. He mocked the music selections as childish, even though he claimed he was joking. Each interaction chipped away at my excitement. Yet my family clung to their usual script. He is stressed. He is protective. He is trying to help. All I had to do was be patient. On the morning of the wedding, when Daniel walked into the bridal suite with that scrutinizing gaze, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. It was the same sensation I had at 8 years old when I heard him stomping down the hallway. At 14, when he ripped my notebook in half during a fight. At 19, when he berated me in front of our cousins for something trivial. The pattern had never ended. It had only disguised itself in the language of adulthood. The thing about patterns is this. Once you learn to survive them, you do not always recognize the danger until it is already unfolding. You normalize the fear because it is the only way to remain functional inside it. That was the truth I refused to face for years. That was the truth that followed me into my wedding day. Standing there in my dress, surrounded by flowers and music and promises of a beautiful future, I was still the girl who had learned to minimize herself to keep someone else from erupting. I believed that if I stayed calm enough, agreeable enough, small enough, the tension would pass. Daniel would settle. The peace would hold. But patterns do not break just because you outgrow them. Sometimes they escalate. Sometimes they sharpen with time. And sometimes, like on my wedding night, they explode into something no one can pretend away. Looking back, I understand that the signs were not subtle. They were not hidden. They had been there all along. We were trained not to name them, trained to silence the truth, trained to protect the person causing harm instead of the person absorbing it. And that silence became the foundation on which everything else was built, including the moment that would end with me unconscious on the ground and waking up under hospital lights with a police officer by my bed. After the ceremony ended and the sun dipped lower behind the Portland evergreens, the celebration shifted into that warm, buzzing part of the evening when everyone is relaxed. Champagne has loosened conversations, and the weight of formalities has lifted from the air. Laughter drifted across the courtyard. The band played a soft jazz set. Guests lined up at the bar, while servers wandered with plates of hors d'oeuvres. On the surface, everything looked exactly like the wedding I had dreamed of. But beneath that beauty was a tightness in my stomach that had been building all day, a sense that something inside Daniel was stretching thinner and thinner, waiting for the smallest pressure to snap. It happened shortly after the photos ended when the photographer released the wedding party and my fiancé was pulled into a group hug by his college friends. I felt a hand on my elbow firm and abrupt. I turned and found Daniel standing too close, his expression unreadable except for the tension in his jaw. "I need to talk to you," he said, "now." It was not a request. It was the tone he used when we were kids, the one that made me instinctively brace for impact. I glanced around for my husband, for Jenna, for anyone who might sense something was wrong, but Daniel stepped slightly between me and the crowd, blocking their view. "It will only take a minute," he added, the forced smile on his face making my skin prickle. Before I could respond, he guided me away from the lights, away from the music, away from the place where people could see us. I should have stopped him. I should have said no. But old conditioning is powerful, and so I walked beside him, telling myself it was just a conversation, just a moment, just something harmless that would pass. He led me through a side door near the reception hall into the service corridor where deliveries were brought in earlier that afternoon. The hallway was stark and industrial, lit by fluorescent lights that hummed faintly. The air smelled of metal shelves and detergent. No music, no laughter, no witnesses. My pulse quickened. Daniel stood in front of me, running a hand through his hair, pacing once before turning sharply as if he had been rehearsing a speech. "You embarrassed me today," he said. His voice echoed slightly in the narrow space. I blinked, unsure if I heard him correctly. How I asked quietly, already feeling the familiar sinking in my chest. He let out a strained laugh, a sound with no humor in it. "You keep acting like you are above me, like you are some perfect bride with your perfect life. You ignore everything I say. You shut me out." That is not what happened. I said, willing my voice to stay steady, willing myself to stay grounded the way therapists tell survivors to stay present. Daniel took a step closer. I took a step back. He noticed. His eyes narrowed. "You think you are in control today?" he murmured. "You think this is your big moment. But you do not get to treat me like I am nothing." I swallowed hard, trying to slow my breathing. "Daniel, please, this is my wedding. Can we talk later?" That was the wrong thing to say. His face changed, tightening in a way that sent a cold rush through my body. He slipped a hand into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, and when he pulled it out, my breath caught. A folding utility knife, the kind venue staff used earlier to cut open boxes. Small, metal, ordinary. Except in his hand, it looked like the most dangerous thing in the world. I froze. Daniel thumbed the handle, not opening it fully, just flicking the edge enough to show the blade beneath. "Do you know how much pressure it takes to make someone listen?" he said softly. His calmness terrified me more than shouting ever could. My voice barely came out. "Put it away, please." He stepped forward. My back hit the metal shelving behind me. I felt the cold steel through the fabric of my dress. My breath shortened, the world narrowed. In movies, this is when someone screams or fights or runs. But in real life, in real American family violence, when the abuser is someone you have known your whole life, your body often chooses survival over logic. Mine went still. Too still. Daniel leaned closer. "You should have respected me. You should have listened." The knife glinted under the fluorescent light. My vision blurred around the edges. A roaring filled my ears like standing too close to the ocean. Then a sudden rush of heat spread through my side. Not pain, not yet, just heat. Then dizziness. Then nothing. The floor tilted. My knees buckled. Daniel's face blurred, melting into white light. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was his voice saying my name. Not with concern, not with love, but with a strange mix of shock and anger, as if I had inconvenienced him by collapsing. Later, people would tell me what happened next. How a server walking by heard the sound of metal clattering against the concrete. How she found me on the ground. How she saw Daniel kneeling beside me, not helping, not calling for anyone, just staring. How she screamed for security. How 2 staff members ran toward us while Daniel tried to stand and leave. How security blocked him from exiting. How one of them shouted for someone to call 911. But I knew none of that as my consciousness slipped away, swallowed by the hum of fluorescent lights and the echo of a lifetime of warnings I had never allowed myself to name. I do not remember hitting the ground, but others would later describe it with a clarity that felt surreal, as if they had witnessed a moment in a film rather than a real woman collapsing on her wedding night. My world had gone silent and weightless, swallowed by darkness, but outside that darkness, everything was movement and panic. A server named Marisol was the first to find me. She had been on her way to restock glassware when she heard a metallic clatter echo down the service corridor, sharp enough to pull her attention away from the bustle of the reception. When she turned the corner, she saw my white dress crumpled on the concrete floor, the hem spread like a fallen sail, and Daniel crouched beside me with an expression that she could never fully explain to police. Not fear, not grief, something colder, something calculating. She froze for a moment, her brain scrambling to understand what she was seeing. Brides did not belong on the floor of a loading hallway. Grooms did not belong in the reception hall without them. Brothers did not belong near an unconscious woman with a blade visible on the ground. It took her a full second to process it before she screamed for help, her voice ricocheting down the corridor and cutting through the music from the reception like a blade of its own. 2 venue security staff, both former college athletes hired for their ability to stay calm under pressure, sprinted toward her voice. When they reached the hallway, they saw Daniel trying to stand, his eyes darting toward the exit door behind him. One of the guards stepped in front of him, blocking the path. "Sir, you need to stay here," he said. Another stepped toward me, checking my pulse, calling my name, tapping my shoulder lightly. No response. My skin was pale, my breathing shallow. Without touching the blade, the guard used his radio to call for supervisors. "We have a medical emergency and a possible assault. Activate emergency protocol." Meanwhile, on the other side of the venue, the reception continued in blissful ignorance for a few more minutes. Guests laughed, clinked glasses, congratulated my husband, who still believed I had stepped away to greet family. The band shifted into a livelier set. My mother chatted with relatives from out of town. My father commented on the flowers. No one knew the bride was lying unconscious beside industrial shelving and a dropped utility knife. Back in the hallway, Daniel attempted to explain himself, but his words came out disjointed. She fainted. She startled. She tripped. I do not know what happened. But his voice trembled in a way that made even the most inexperienced observer suspicious. The first guard kept him in place with a steady, practiced calm the venue trained them for. "Sir, please keep your hands where I can see them. Help is coming." Marisol, still trembling, slid down the wall and began to cry, insisting that she had seen the knife fall from his hand. The guard reassured her and told her not to touch anything. The corridor was now officially a potential crime scene. Within minutes, the venue supervisor arrived, assessed the situation, and pulled the fire door closed at the end of the hallway to prevent guests from wandering into the area. He asked the second guard to stay with me, continue monitoring my breathing, and prepare space for paramedics. Then he turned to Daniel, asking in a controlled tone what happened. Daniel repeated his story, adding new details that contradicted the first ones. My supervisor later told me that was when he knew something was deeply wrong. At that moment, my husband finally noticed I had been gone too long. He sent Jenna to find me, and when she asked staff if they had seen me, someone mentioned hearing a call for security on the radio. Jenna's instincts kicked in. She followed the direction of the commotion and reached the blocked hallway just as paramedics were arriving. She pushed forward until a guard stopped her, and when he said my name, her scream echoed even louder than Marisol's earlier cry. Meanwhile, the paramedics assessed me quickly. Blood pressure low, consciousness unresponsive. They worked with swift efficiency, following protocol without hesitation. No one asked whether Daniel was telling the truth. No one asked whether the family wanted intervention. In the United States, emergency response never defers to family when the patient is unconscious and the circumstances unclear. They secured my neck, lifted me onto a gurney, and began moving me toward the ambulance station outside the venue. As they wheeled me through the service corridor, I floated somewhere between darkness and muted sensation, catching only fragments of sound. Someone saying my name, someone crying, a man insisting they had the wrong idea. Then the sudden burst of cold air as we exited into the night. At that same time, police arrived. Standard response for a call involving an unconscious woman and a reported weapon. 2 officers approached the scene, taking statements, while another moved to secure Daniel away from the main pathway separating him from staff and my family. The questions were straightforward and procedural. Did anyone see what happened? Did anyone touch the knife? Did the suspect attempt to flee? Did the victim show signs of breathing difficulty? Witnesses described Daniel's demeanor, his inconsistency, his attempt to walk away the visible blade. The officers documented every detail. Inside the ambulance, a paramedic placed an oxygen mask over my face, her voice steady and low as she updated the hospital through radio. Unconscious female, 27. Possible trauma, knife involved. Police notified. While I hovered between awareness and nothingness, Daniel's narrative began to crumble. Every witness contradicted him. Every movement he made was interpreted through the lens of suspicion. And for the first time in my life, authority stepped in before family loyalty could rewrite the story. The ambulance doors slammed shut. The sirens ignited. The world blurred into motion. And even though I would not wake until hours later, this was the exact moment when the truth finally stopped being a private burden and became a matter for the law. When consciousness finally began to stitch itself back together, it happened in pieces, as if someone were slowly turning up the dimmer switch on reality. At first, there was only sound, a low mechanical hum cutting through the fog, the steady rhythm of something beeping beside me, a faint murmur of voices that grew sharper with every second. Then came the sensations, a chill across my arms, a dull ache in my ribs, the faint press of an oxygen mask shaping my breath. And then, with a jolt of awareness that made my stomach twist, came the light, a harsh white glare above me, unmistakable in its sterile brightness. I knew that light. It belonged to an emergency room. I was lying in a hospital bed draped in warm blankets, the IV line tugging gently at the crook of my arm. My head felt heavy cotton, like as though I had been underwater for hours. I blinked, trying to focus, and shapes began to form at the edges of my vision. A nurse stood at my left side, checking my vitals. At the foot of the bed, a doctor flipped through paperwork on a clipboard. And beside my right shoulder, standing with an alert stillness that tightened my throat, was a uniformed police officer. His presence was grounding and terrifying at the same time. Authority meant safety, but authority also meant something serious had happened, something criminal, something that could no longer be brushed aside the way my family had always brushed aside Daniel's behavior. My breathing hitched, the sound muffled beneath the oxygen mask. The nurse noticed immediately and lowered her voice to something gentle. "You are okay, Claire. You are safe. You are in the emergency department at Providence Medical Center. You were brought in unconscious." She paused for a moment, her expression tightening in a way I could not yet interpret. "This is a mandatory report." The phrasing hit me like a physical impact. Mandatory reporting in the United States meant one thing: there was suspected violence. There was a weapon. There was law enforcement involvement, whether I wanted it or not. I felt my pulse quicken beneath the monitor clipped to my finger. The police officer stepped slightly closer. His tone, calm, controlled the kind of voice meant to soothe rather than alarm. "Miss Carter, I am Officer Delgado. I am here as part of protocol given the circumstances of your arrival. You are not in trouble. You are safe. But I need to ask you a few questions when you feel stable." The doctor moved to my side, next adjusting the angle of my bed to raise me slightly. "Let us take it one step at a time," he said. "You experienced a loss of consciousness. Your imaging shows no acute brain bleed, which is excellent news, but you have signs consistent with trauma. We already gave you fluids and ran labs. You are stable." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Do you remember anything before you passed out?" The question hovered in the air like a held breath. Memory arrived in fragments, slippery and disjointed. My dress. The humming fluorescent lights. A cold metal shelf. Daniel's voice too close. The glint of a small blade. The sudden heat in my side. My body tensed beneath the blankets, and the nurse gently placed a hand on my arm. "It is okay," she whispered. "You are safe now." The officer remained silent, giving me space, but his presence was sharp, waiting. My lips parted, but the words tangled. I remembered too much and too little at the same time. My throat tightened. I inhaled shakily. The doctor softened his tone. "What is the last thing you clearly recall?" I closed my eyes, forcing focus, dragging the pieces of memory into place like stones across water. I saw myself in the service corridor. I heard Daniel's voice. I felt the cold shelving at my back. And then I remembered the knife. My chest tightened, but I managed to whisper, "I was with my brother." The air shifted in the room. The officer leaned forward, slightly attentive, but not intrusive. "Was anyone else present?" he asked carefully. I shook my head, just enough to indicate no. My side burned faintly beneath the bandage I had not yet noticed. The doctor followed my gesture and answered the question I had not asked. "You have a superficial laceration. Not deep enough to require sutures internally, but you did bleed and you did collapse quickly. Combined with your loss of consciousness, it is consistent with acute shock." My stomach turned. A cut. A collapse. A wedding. A brother. The nurse exchanged a glance with the officer, the kind professionals share, when a scenario has crossed from medical urgency into criminal territory. The officer cleared his throat softly. "Miss Carter, I want to assure you of something very important. Whatever happened, the responsibility is not yours. You are not required to protect anyone. You are only required to tell us what you are comfortable sharing." His words sliced through years of conditioning so sharply that tears welled in my eyes without warning. Not required to protect anyone. Not required to minimize. Not required to smooth things over. My voice trembled as I fought to speak, but before the words fully formed, the nurse adjusted my oxygen mask and shook her head gently. "You do not have to talk yet. Rest first. Everything can wait until you are ready." The officer nodded in agreement. "I will be right outside when you feel up to it." My mind drifted again, overloaded, but before sleep pulled me back under a terrifying realization bloomed in my chest. I did not know yet what had happened after I went unconscious. I did not know if my husband had seen me, or if my parents knew, or if the wedding had erupted into chaos. I did not know what Daniel had told people, or whether he had tried to leave. The world had moved without me, decisions made, statements given, narratives forming, and I was waking up in the aftermath with no idea how far the damage had spread. The doctor dimmed the overhead lights. The nurse pressed a call button into my hand. The officer stepped out into the hallway, speaking softly into his radio. As the door clicked closed, I stared at the ceiling, the same sterile white that had greeted me when I first opened my eyes. I swallowed thin and shaky. Somewhere deep inside me, a truth finally settled into place. This was not a family conflict anymore. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not something I could minimize or excuse. This was felony assault, and for the first time in my life, there were people in the room who would not look away. I had barely drifted back into a light, restless sleep when the door to my room opened again this time without the calm professionalism of medical staff or the quiet authority of law enforcement. It was the sound of hurried breathing, whispered urgency, and the unmistakable cadence of my mother's voice trying to control her panic. "Claire, honey, oh my goodness, are you awake?" she blurted out before the nurse could stop her. She rushed to my bedside with my father trailing behind her, both of them wide-eyed, still wearing the formal clothes from the wedding, but disheveled now as if the night had aged them in hours. My mother's mascara had smudged beneath her eyes. My father's tie was askew. They looked shaken, but not in the way I expected. Not with grief or horror for what had happened to me. Their panic carried a different weight entirely. A weight I recognized. Damage control. Before I could speak, before I could even fully sit up, my mother leaned over me and lowered her voice to a trembling whisper. "Please do not say anything to the police until we talk." My stomach dropped. The nurse stepped forward, prepared to intervene, but my mother waved her off with a shaky smile. "Just a family moment," she said, as if my assault were a small misunderstanding, rather than a crime scene documented by security footage and a hallway smeared with blood I had not even known I lost. My father placed a hand on the foot of the bed, gripping the metal rail as if steadying himself. "Claire, this is serious," he said, "but please do not make it worse." The words felt like a blow to the chest. Make it worse! As if being stabbed, collapsing, and waking up in a hospital with a police officer stationed outside my door was something I had done to inconvenience them. I pulled away from my mother's touch, my voice hoarse as I whispered, "He attacked me." She glanced quickly at the closed hospital door, then lowered her voice even more. "Honey, we do not know that. You fainted. You panicked. These things happen." I felt something inside me crack in a way I could not hold together anymore. I remembered the pattern. I remembered every time they dismissed his behavior to keep the peace. I remembered being told to be the bigger person, to let things go, to not escalate. But hearing it now, while lying in a hospital bed with a bandage covering the evidence of what he had done, felt like betrayal sharpened into something unbearable. My father tried to take a gentler tone, as if this were a negotiation instead of a moral reckoning. "Daniel is in bad shape right now. The police want to question him. He is scared. He is confused. Please do not say anything that could ruin his life." I stared at him in disbelief, my throat burning with a mixture of grief and rage. Ruin his life. As if my life were intact. As if my wedding were not destroyed. As if I had not woken up surrounded by machines instead of guests. My mother reached for my hand again, her voice trembling with that familiar pleading tone. "Families stick together, Claire. We can get through this quietly. No need to drag law enforcement into it." I could not help the bitter laugh that slipped out. "They are already involved. There is an officer outside the door. There was a knife, there were witnesses." Her face paled, and for the first time since she entered the room, she seemed to grasp the gravity of what she had walked into. Still, she pressed on. "You can tell them it was an accident. You can say he startled you. You can say you tripped. We just need you to be careful with your words." My breath caught painfully. Be careful with my words. The same instruction I had been given my entire life to protect the person causing harm. Before I could respond, the door opened again. This time, it was the officer. He stepped inside with calm, polite firmness. "I am sorry, but I need to ask you both to step out. The patient needs rest and cannot be questioned or influenced right now." My mother stiffened. "We are her parents. We have a right to be here." The officer did not flinch. "Not when there is an active investigation. Please, step outside." My father attempted to negotiate, but the officer's tone never shifted. It was the tone of someone who had seen every version of denial, every attempt to rewrite events, every family who tried to shield the aggressor instead of the victim. "This is for her protection," he said. Their faces changed at that, not with concern for me, but with the dawning realization that the narrative they wanted to control was slipping from their hands. The nurse gently guided them toward the door, and just before leaving, my mother turned back, desperation rising beneath her words. "Claire, please, think about your brother. He needs help, not punishment." Then they were gone, the door clicking shut behind them like a final punctuation mark on a lifetime of misplaced loyalty. The officer pulled a chair beside the bed but did not sit yet. Instead, he stood quietly, giving me space to breathe. "When you are ready," he said softly, "we will take your statement. But let me be absolutely clear. What happened to you is not your fault, and you do not owe anyone your silence." My vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall. The truth settled over me like a weight and a relief at the same time. If I died on that concrete floor, they would have protected him anyway. If I had not woken up, they would have rewritten the story to preserve his reputation. In that moment, lying in a hospital bed with the officer's steady presence beside me, I understood something I had never allowed myself to say. My family would rather break me than let the world see who he really was. And for the first time, I felt a quiet, crystallizing certainty that I would not let them rewrite this. Not this time. Not ever again. The investigation began before I was fully awake, unfolding in parallel lines of procedure that had nothing to do with family loyalty and everything to do with evidence documentation and the way the American legal system responds when a woman arrives at an emergency room with injuries inconsistent with an accident. By the time morning light began filtering through the narrow ER window, the detective assigned to my case had already reviewed the initial police report, interviewed the venue staff, and requested copies of all surveillance footage from the reception hall. I learned all of this in fragments as the nurse updated me gently, careful not to overwhelm me, but firm in making sure I understood the seriousness of the situation. When Detective Harper finally entered my room, he carried himself with the quiet steadiness of someone who had done this many times before. He was in his late 40s, dressed in a gray suit, his badge clipped discreetly to his belt. His tone was calm neutral, grounded in professionalism rather than sympathy, and for some reason, that steadiness made me trust him immediately. He began by setting a small recorder on the tray table beside me. "Standard procedure," he said. "You can pause at any point. You can decline to answer anything. This is your pace, not mine." I nodded, my throat tight, the oxygen mask now replaced with a nasal cannula. "Before we get to what you remember," he continued, "I want you to know what we already have. That way you do not feel pressured to carry this alone." He opened a small notebook and began reading facts, not emotions, not interpretations, just facts. At 8:17 p.m., a venue employee called 911 reporting a woman down in a service corridor with possible stab trauma. At 8:19, venue security detained your brother Daniel Carter after observing him attempting to move away from the scene. At 8:23, paramedics arrived. At 8:31, you were transported to Providence Medical Center. At 8:49, officers collected a folding utility knife found beside your body. My breath caught at the word beside. I had not seen it fall. I had not seen anything after the moment the world tilted. Detective Harper continued without pause, as if anticipating the emotional impact and steadying the ground beneath my feet. "We also have 3 witnesses who say the knife fell from your brother's hand when he stood. One witness reports hearing you say stop. Another reports seeing your brother block the exit. None of them are related to you or to him. None of them have a reason to lie." I closed my eyes, swallowing the wave of nausea rising in my chest. No amount of minimization or family persuasion could erase witness accounts. No amount of pleading from my parents could change what multiple people had seen with their own eyes. Harper let a moment pass before speaking again. "The venue has cameras in the loading hallway," he said. "They do not capture audio, but they do capture movement." I felt the room tilt slightly. That hallway, that blur of fear. That moment, caught on camera. He nodded gently when he saw my reaction. "We do not need you to relive anything beyond what you are comfortable sharing. The investigation does not depend on your memory alone." That sentence eased something in me I had not known was clenched. For the first time in my life, the truth did not rest entirely on whether I spoke it correctly, gently, diplomatically enough to avoid blowback. The truth existed outside of me now. Evidence speaks. He waited until my breathing steadied again before asking the first question. "What is the last thing you clearly remember before losing consciousness?" I told him slowly. The service corridor, the hum of fluorescent lights, the cold shelf against my back, Daniel's words, the knife, my knees giving out. Harper wrote without reacting emotionally, without leaning forward as if hungry for drama. He documented calmly the way someone records weather patterns. Predictable, factual, undeniable. When I finished, he closed his notebook. "That aligns with everything we have so far," he said. "You have done exactly what you needed to do." My eyes stung. No one had ever said that to me about surviving Daniel. Harper continued outlining the next steps, his tone steady. "Daniel is currently detained for questioning. Given the witness statement's physical evidence and your medical records, this case is moving toward felony assault charges. There is no scenario where this is treated as an accident." I felt a tremor move through me. Finality. Certainty. The kind of clarity my family had spent years avoiding. Harper noticed and softened his tone just enough to offer reassurance without crossing into pity. "I want to remind you that you are not responsible for managing your family's reactions. You are not responsible for his defense or his narrative. Your only responsibility is to your own safety and recovery." It was like he had reached into the very script of my childhood and torn it in half. He stood then, offering a card with his direct line. "I will keep you updated. If you remember anything else, even something small, call me. And Claire, you are not alone in this." When he left the room, fell quiet again, except for the steady beep of the monitor. I lay back against the pillows, absorbing everything. 3 witnesses, surveillance footage, a recovered knife, a documented injury, police detainment, evidence layered upon evidence, creating a record my parents could not erase. Daniel could not explain away, and I could not be coerced into rewriting. I thought about my mother's pleas. "Think about your brother." I thought about my father's worry. "Do not ruin his life." But the investigation did not bend to their fear or their denial. It followed facts the way justice is supposed to. And as the reality settled in a strange, steadying sensation warmed my chest. For the first time in my life, the truth did not depend on my family's permission. It belonged to the record now. In the hours that followed Detective Harper's visit, the hospital room became a kind of quiet battlefield where competing narratives tried to take shape, each one built not on truth but on desperation, fear, and the familiar family instinct to protect the wrong person at any cost. Word had already spread through the guests, and though hospital protocol kept most people out, my phone buzzed constantly on the tray beside me with messages I was too drained to open. My parents' names appeared repeatedly, followed by missed calls from relatives who had never checked on me during any crisis in my life, yet now felt entitled to shape the story of my assault before I could even breathe without pain. My mother returned first, slipping into the room with the kind of cautious politeness she used when she was preparing to say something manipulative but wanted to mask it with concern. She perched on the edge of the chair, hands folded tightly in her lap, and for a moment she just stared at me as if trying to memorize my injuries. Then her voice softened in a way that might have comforted me years ago before I learned what softness can hide. "Claire, honey, the family is panicking. Everyone is saying different things. We just need to make sure no one misunderstands what happened." I turned my head toward her slowly, the motion pulling at the ache beneath my ribs. "What do you think happened, Mom?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Daniel says you startled him, that you stumbled, that you fainted. He is devastated. He is a mess. You know your brother. He never meant for anything like this." I stared at her in disbelief. Meant? As if my collapsing unconscious with a cut on my body and witnesses describing a weapon were the unfortunate side effect of his clumsiness rather than his violence. Mom continued, her voice trembling in a way that might have been real grief or performative anxiety. "He is terrified the police will twist this. He is afraid they will ruin his life over an accident." My throat tightened at the word accident. I had heard that word my entire childhood. It was the shield my family used to excuse everything from broken objects to bruised arms to the fear that lived in my stomach whenever Daniel was in a bad mood. It was the same word they used when I cried at age 12 after he shoved me into a dresser. The same word they used when he snapped at teachers. The same word that had stitched itself into our family culture so deeply that even now, even with a hospital wristband around my arm, they reached for it as their first line of defense. Before I could respond, my father arrived walking in with a forced calm that felt like another performance meant for my benefit, but really meant for his own. He nodded curtly to my mother, then looked at me with the solemnity of someone delivering bad news that he had convinced himself was noble. "We spoke to your brother," he said. "He is shaken. He does not remember everything, but he swears he did not harm you intentionally. Your mother and I think it would be best if you did not give an official statement until we have all talked as a family." My pulse spiked. "I already did," I said quietly. The room went still. My father blinked, stunned. "You... what?" I repeated it. I gave my statement to the detective. My parents exchanged a look, the kind that held more emotion than either would speak aloud. Panic, anger, fear, and beneath it all, something darker. The realization that the narrative they were building had crumbled before it could form. My mother stood abruptly, her composure cracking at the edges. "Claire, why would you do that without us? You know how these things can look. You know how police can exaggerate situations." I laughed, a hollow sound that scraped my throat. "Exaggerate. Mom, there is surveillance footage. There are witnesses. There was a knife." The door opened suddenly, and for a split second, all three of us turned, expecting the detective. But it was Jenna, my maid of honor, still in the wrinkled dress from the night before. Eyes red from crying, but burning with fury I had never seen in her. "Good," she said sharply when she saw my parents. "You are here." Maybe now someone can explain why half the guests are calling this an accident when there are 3 witnesses who watched Daniel try to walk away from her unconscious body. My mother inhaled sharply. "Jenna, this is not the time." "No," Jenna said, stepping forward. "This is exactly the time. Claire almost died, and all anyone in your family is talking about is your son's reputation." Her voice shook with anger, and for a moment I saw something shift in my father's face, something like shame flickering through the layers of denial. But he pushed it down quickly. He straightened his shoulders. "We are simply trying to avoid misunderstandings. Misunderstandings do not include knives," Jenna snapped. "Misunderstandings do not require paramedics. Misunderstandings do not involve police detaining someone." My mother turned to me again, desperate now. "Claire, please, your brother's career, his future, everything he has worked for, could be destroyed if this goes too far." My voice broke as I said the thing that had been building since the moment I woke under hospital lights. So could my mom. So could my life. Her face went pale as if she had finally heard the truth in my voice. But recovery is a stubborn teacher. Once you hear your own truth out loud, it is impossible to unhear it. And my truth was this. My family was not worried about what happened to me. They were worried about what I might say. They were worried about the story being taken out of their hands. They were worried about a record they could not rewrite. The door opened again, and this time it was indeed Detective Harper, his expression steady but sharper when he saw my parents. He nodded politely to Jenna, then addressed my family with controlled professionalism. "I need the room," he said. "We will continue our interview with Claire now." My mother began to protest, but he held up a hand. "Interference with a victim during an active investigation is not permitted. Please step out." My father exhaled slowly, defeated. My mother hesitated, eyes glistening, then finally followed him out. And as the door closed behind them, I felt something inside me settle for the first time in my life. Their rewrite had failed. The truth was no longer theirs to shape. And I, for the first time, was no longer the silent participant in my own story. The moment Detective Harper closed the door, the room shifted from a battlefield of family pressure to something cleaner, sharper, more aligned with reality. He pulled the small rolling stool close to my bedside and opened a thin folder that I recognized immediately as part of my medical chart, a tangible reminder that the story of what happened to me was no longer built on anyone's opinion, but on objective evidence that could not be softened or twisted. "Claire," he began, his tone steady without being cold. "I want to review a few things with you now that the physicians have completed their preliminary reports." He set the folder on the tray beside my arm and tapped the top page. "This is your medical assessment. These injuries are consistent with an assault, not a fall. And before you worry that I am interpreting that too broadly, your medical team documented the angles, the depth, and the pressure points. Medical records do not speculate, they describe. And your injuries describe an intentional act. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening, even though I had known this in my bones since the moment I woke up under hospital lights. Still hearing it framed objectively pierced through layers of denial I had inherited from my family. He continued, "You also have defensive marks on your hands, bruising on the forearms, patterns that align with someone trying to push another person away." I stared at my hands, the faint swelling around my knuckles, the tender ache in my wrist. I had not remembered raising my arms in those final seconds, but my body had remembered for me. The detective slid another document onto the tray. "As of this morning, the district attorney's office has assigned a prosecutor to your case. Assault with a deadly weapon. Felony classification. Mandatory reporting from the hospital triggered it automatically. This is not optional. The state is involved now." Emotional undulation hit me unexpectedly, a wave of nausea mixed with relief. For the first time, someone in authority was acknowledging what had happened without minimizing it. No one was saying he is stressed or he did not mean it or you know how he gets. Instead, the language was precise and unflinching. Deadly weapon. Assault. Felony. The detective paused, waiting for me to absorb it, then continued. "There is another step we need to take. Based on the circumstances, you qualify for an emergency protective order. This would legally prohibit Daniel from contacting you, approaching you, or coming within a certain distance." I blinked, stunned. My own brother. The idea of a protective order felt surreal, like something that belonged in a documentary about another woman's life, not mine. But the surrealness of it did not make it less necessary. "Claire," he said gently, "protective orders are not punishment. They are safety tools. They tell the court and law enforcement that you are at risk and need boundaries set by the law, not by family negotiations." He said the word family with deliberate neutrality, acknowledging what had just happened in this room without criticizing them outright. I let out a long breath. "Yes, I want it." He nodded, already writing. "Good. It will be issued before he is released from holding." My heartbeat stumbled. "He is still in custody." "For now," Detective Harper said. "He was detained at the venue based on witness reports and the presence of the weapon, but his attorney is pushing hard for release. The protective order ensures you are not vulnerable if that happens." Vulnerable. The word lodged in my chest. I had spent 27 years pretending I was not vulnerable, pretending that endurance equaled safety, pretending that growing up with Daniel meant I understood how to manage him. But I had been wrong. Horribly, dangerously wrong. The detective stood closing the folder. "Claire, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer without thinking of how your parents will react." He waited until my eyes met his. "Do you believe what happened was an accident?" The question cracked open something deep inside me. I remembered Daniel's face in that dim service corridor, the way his voice hissed with resentment, the flicker of metal catching the overhead light, the heat blooming under my ribs right before the world tilted. And then I remembered every moment that had led up to it, stretching back years, each one of them wearing the label accident like a disguise. I exhaled slowly. No, it was not an accident. His expression softened with a kind of respect that made me feel seen in a way I had not felt in years. "Thank you for your honesty. That matters. It matters more than you know." After he left, the silence in the room felt different, no longer heavy with fear, but full of a growing clarity that pushed against my ribs until it became almost physical. A nurse came in to check my vitals, adjusting the IV line with practiced efficiency. She glanced at the clipboard, then at me, her eyes warm but professional. "You are doing the right thing," she said quietly. "Medical records do not lie, and neither should you have to." When she left, I stared up at the ceiling tiles and let the truth settle into place. This was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not Daniel being emotional or stressed or pushed into a moment he could not control. This was abuse. The word tasted foreign in my mouth at first, but then something shifted and it tasted like accuracy, like liberation. Like finally naming the storm I had lived in for years. Abuse. My brother abused me. Saying it in my mind made my chest tighten, but it also made the room feel wider, the air clearer, the future less impossible. Because once you name abuse, you can no longer unknow it. You cannot pretend it is something smaller or softer or safer. You cannot hide it behind family loyalty or childhood memories or fear of being the one who breaks the silence. You cannot return to the world as it was. You can only walk forward. That night, as machines hummed quietly around me and the hallway lights outside my room dimmed, I made a decision that felt like the beginning of the rest of my life. I would not protect Daniel. I would not protect the story my parents wanted to tell. I would not bend myself into the shape of a dutiful daughter who prioritizes someone else's comfort over her own safety. I would tell the truth. And the truth written in medical ink and legal language and the bruises still forming on my skin was finally mine to claim. By the time the sun rose the next morning, word had already begun to circulate far beyond the walls of the hospital. I did not know how exactly it spread so quickly, but trauma has a way of traveling faster than truth, and in this case, the truth was loud enough to outrun every attempt my family had made to contain it. The first sign came when a hospital volunteer peeked into my room carrying a cardboard vase of flowers. "These are from the staff at the Ridgeview Event Center," she said with a sympathetic smile. "They wanted you to know they are thinking of you." I stared at the bouquet, stunned. I had not expected anything from the venue, much less a collective gesture. Tucked inside the flowers was a handwritten note signed by 6 employees. "We saw what we saw. We are here if you need statements." Those 8 words hit me harder than any apology my family could have offered. They validated every second I had been told to downplay or reinterpret. A few hours later, Dominic, one of the venue coordinators, called my hospital room directly after getting my number from the detective. "Claire," he said, his voice steady and sincere, "I want you to know that all of us are giving full statements. What happened was not your fault, and it was not ambiguous." I remembered the look on his face as he rushed toward me in the corridor moments after I fell. Shock, fear, disbelief, and behind all of that, something that looked painfully familiar: recognition. The kind of recognition that comes from witnessing something you know has roots deeper than a single moment. "Thank you," I whispered, realizing how rarely I had been able to say those words to anyone outside my handful of friends. Later that afternoon, a different kind of moral verdict arrived. My Aunt Marlene, my father's older sister, who had always been the quiet observer at family gatherings, entered my room with a look that immediately made my throat tighten. "Claire," she said softly as she sat down beside me, "I owe you an apology." I braced myself for another round of excuses, but instead, she surprised me. "We failed you. Not just yesterday. For years." My breath stopped. Hearing those words spoken aloud by someone in my family felt unreal, like a dream I had not dared to imagine. "Your mother called me this morning," she continued, her voice shaking. "She is still trying to make sense of everything, but I told her something she did not want to hear. I told her that protecting Daniel at your expense is not love, it is cowardice." Emotional undulations surged through me again, an abrupt shift from shock to gratitude to grief so tangled that I could not separate them. The truth was painful, but it was finally being spoken by someone other than myself. That changed everything. By evening, 2 of my cousins sent text messages asking if I needed support. A coworker from my old job left a voicemail saying she wished she had checked on me more often because she had sensed something off at every holiday event where Daniel hovered too close. Even Natalie forwarded screenshots from mutual acquaintances who had heard an edited version of the story from my mother, but had begun to question it after talking to venue staff. People were recalibrating. They were rearranging their understanding of who Daniel was and what he was capable of. But the most powerful shift came late that night when my father finally returned to the hospital alone. He stood in the doorway with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not anger, not disappointment, but something heavy and brittle that looked like loss. He pulled a chair close to the bed and sank into it slowly, as if the act of sitting required more strength than he possessed. "Claire," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I watched the footage. I froze, my pulse slamming against my ribs. "There is footage." He nodded. "The venue security cameras. Detective Harper showed me a portion because I insisted on understanding the situation before speaking to you again. For years, I had watched this man defend Daniel with a loyalty that bordered on blindness. Now he looked as though that loyalty had been ripped out from under him. I did not want to believe it, he continued. I truly did not. But what I saw, there was no accident, no misunderstanding, no version of events where this was anything other than what it was. He swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Your brother hurt you. On purpose. His voice broke on the last word. Something inside me softened and hardened at the same time. This was the father I had needed my entire life, not the one who smoothed conflict over, but the one who finally looked the monster in the eye and named it. I am so sorry, he said, leaning forward. I am sorry for every time I told you to keep the peace. Sorry for every moment I dismissed your discomfort. Sorry for raising you in a home where you learned to believe that surviving Daniel was your responsibility. The apology cracked open something deep in my chest, a mixture of sorrow and relief that made my eyes sting. Dad, I whispered, I needed you to see it. He nodded, tears shining in his eyes. I see it now, and I will not hide behind denial again. The moral verdict was no longer coming only from strangers or acquaintances. It was now emerging from the very structure of the family that had once protected Daniel. The shift felt monumental, transformative, real. The next morning, Detective Harper returned to give me an update. Statements are piling up faster than we expected, he said, sounding almost impressed. Your case is strong, Claire. Stronger than most cases that come through mandatory reporting channels. Venue staff guests, relatives, even a bartender who overheard Daniel bragging earlier in the night that he was going to have a serious conversation with you whether you liked it or not. As he spoke, I felt something quiet but powerful settle into my bones. This was the moral verdict. Not handed down by a court, yet not signed by a judge. Not etched into legal records, but inscribed in the observations testimonies and confessions of the people who had witnessed pieces of the truth long before I had the courage or the clarity to name it. All of them were saying the same thing now. We failed you. We see it, and we are choosing differently. For the first time since the attack, I let myself believe that the world was shifting in my favor, not through vengeance, not through rage, but through the simple, undeniable power of truth finally being told out loud without apology. The day after the detectives finalized their initial interviews, a new figure appeared in my hospital room, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, a simple navy suit, and a presence that instantly quieted every corner of the space. Claire, she said, extending a card into my hand. I am Assistant District Attorney Marisol Vega. I am the prosecutor assigned to your case. The weight of the moment settled over me slowly as she pulled up a chair. I had known intellectually that the state was pursuing charges, but seeing the prosecutor in person made the entire process feel suddenly real, grounded in a system bigger than my family, my history, or the fear that had followed me since childhood. First, she said, I want to make something very clear. You do not need to prove anything to us. The evidence already meets the standard for felony assault with a deadly weapon. The case is not riding on your testimony alone. That sentence released a breath I did not realize I had been holding since waking up in the ER. For years, Daniel had relied on one rule: no one believes you unless you collapse. No one takes you seriously unless you bleed in public. Now, for the first time, the burden was not mine to carry. ADA Vega continued. The venue cameras captured enough to establish intent. Multiple staff members and guests corroborated the sequence of events. The medical documentation aligns with an attack rather than an accident. This case is solid. I nodded slowly, absorbing each piece of reassurance, as if collecting bricks to rebuild something inside myself. She opened a folder and slid a paper toward me. Daniel's attorney has already approached us for a plea discussion. My pulse quickened. So soon. Vega nodded. These cases move fast when the evidence is overwhelming. They are hoping to avoid trial. She paused long enough for me to understand the implication. Avoiding trial meant avoiding a public reckoning, avoiding testimony, avoiding the possibility of a jury learning the full extent of Daniel's history. What does the plea look like? I asked quietly. She folded her hands on the folder. The standard offer for an assault with a deadly weapon case involving a family member, no prior convictions and substantial evidence, is this a guilty plea? Classification as a felony probation with strict conditions, mandatory treatment, a no-contact order that extends several years, and potential jail time depending on the judge. She studied me carefully, gauging my reaction. If it goes to trial, the penalty could be significantly higher, she said, but the emotional toll on you would be greater as well. Emotional undulation rose inside me again, a pendulum swing between vindication and dread. Part of me wanted the world to hear every detail, to witness the truth of what Daniel had done. Another part wanted the chapter closed as soon as possible without drawing me back into reliving each second under oath. Vega placed the folder back in her bag. You do not have to decide today. The next hearing will be scheduled once you are discharged. You will have time to think. After she left, I sat in the hospital bed staring at the ceiling, letting the pieces move around in my mind. The American justice system was not dramatic or cinematic. It was slow, methodical, procedural, but it was real, and for the first time, it was on my side. 2 days later, when I was cleared to leave the hospital, Detective Harper met me near the exit. Before you go, he said, I want to update you on something important. The judge has issued the emergency protective order. It is active immediately. I felt a rush of relief so sharp it brought tears to my eyes. He also handed me paperwork outlining Daniel's bail hearing. His attorney is arguing that he is not a flight risk. The prosecution is pushing for strict conditions, including monitoring. I nodded, gripping the papers. Thank you. Once home, I found the stillness of my apartment overwhelming. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow sharper. But I also felt something new. Something I could not name yet, but sensed was the beginning of a separate life. A few days later, the bail hearing took place. I did not attend, but ADA Vega called me as soon as it ended. The judge granted bail with conditions, she said, but the protective order stands. He cannot come near you and he must surrender all weapons. The system was doing what it could, however imperfectly, and that mattered. Over the next week, updates continued arriving like slow ripples from a stone thrown into deep water. More statements, more evidence, more people finally acknowledging what they had seen but never named. And then came the moment that shifted the entire direction of the case. Detective Harper called me one morning with a tone that was steady but charged. Claire, you should know something. Daniel is considering accepting the plea deal. The words hung in the air heavy but strangely liberating. He is realizing that a trial could expose far more than the incident itself. Harper continued. His attorney is advising him that the surveillance footage alone is enough for conviction. Emotional undulation hit again, a wave of victory mixed with sorrow. This was my brother. This was the boy who had shoved me into walls, taken things from me, mocked me until I cried. This was the man who had slipped a knife from his pocket and turned my wedding into an ER intake report. And now, finally, he was standing on ground he could not manipulate. The law does not accept charm or excuses or family loyalty. The law accepts evidence. The day of the plea hearing arrived under a cold gray sky. I sat in the courthouse hallway with Natalie beside me, her presence a steady anchor. Vega approached with a calm assurance that steadied my shaking hands. If he accepts the plea, she said, the judge will determine the exact terms. Felony conviction, probation supervision, mandatory violence intervention, extended no contact, and the record will follow him permanently. That last sentence sent a quiet heat through my chest. Permanently. For once, permanence was not something to fear. When the courtroom doors finally opened, I stepped inside each footfall landing with a clarity I had not known on my wedding day. Daniel stood at the defense table looking smaller than I had ever seen him, not vulnerable, not remorseful, just cornered by a system that refused to bend around him. The judge asked the standard questions. Daniel answered with a voice that sounded thin and strained, and then it happened. He entered a plea of guilty. The word echoed in my chest like a final bell closing a chapter that had begun long before the knife ever touched my skin. Justice the American way was not theatrical. It was not about revenge. It was about the slow, deliberate realignment of truth after years of distortion. As we stepped out of the courthouse, the cold air hit my face, and for the first time since waking up beneath hospital lights, I felt the full weight of justice settling around me. Not perfect, not complete, but real. And real was enough. In the days following the plea hearing, the world felt strangely quiet, as if everything around me had shifted a few inches to the left while I was not looking. The case was no longer a question mark hovering over my life. It had become a line in the sand drawn by a court, a judge the state, and by me. But justice, even when achieved, does not immediately stitch together the parts of you that were torn open. It simply gives you a place to stand while you begin the work. The first morning I woke up at home without machines humming beside me or nurses checking vitals, the silence pressed against my ears. It was the same apartment I had lived in for 3 years, the same walls painted by the same hands, but everything felt different. I walked into the kitchen, barefoot, opened a window, and let the cold air slide across my skin. It stung in a way that reminded me I was alive. Natalie arrived an hour later with grocery bags and that fierce expression she wore whenever she was determined to take care of me even without my permission. "I can see the headlines now," she said, setting fruit on the counter. "Woman survives attempted homicide and is immediately forced to eat blueberries by controlling friend." I smiled despite myself. Humor was her way of creating air pockets in the suffocating parts of life. But behind the jokes, her eyes carried a gentleness that made something inside me loosen. "Therapy," she said casually as she rinsed a mug. "I booked you with someone highly recommended by my coworker. You start Monday." I blinked. She grinned. "You are welcome." Emotional undulation rose again, a tug between resistance and relief. Therapy was not new to me, but real therapy, trauma therapy. The kind that asks you to stop performing and start feeling was something I had avoided for years. I opened my mouth to protest and then closed it again. "Thank you," I said quietly. Later that afternoon, I received an email from Ada Vega summarizing the next steps. Daniel's sentencing hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. During that time, the no-contact order was extended and formalized. The restrictions were clear. He could not come near my home, my job, or anyone closely associated with me. He could not communicate in any form. He could not request information about me from third parties. The clarity of the document felt like oxygen. Boundaries set by law, not by pleading, not by negotiation, not by sacrificing my comfort to maintain family peace. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the years leading up to all of this. The memories were jagged, scattered, disorganized, but they carried a common thread. Every time Daniel hurt me physically or emotionally, someone in my family had said the same line. "He does not mean it. He is under stress. He is your brother." That last one had been the heaviest chain. He is your brother, as if that single fact meant I was responsible for absorbing the blows, for shrinking to fit the shape of his rage, for sacrificing pieces of myself to keep him stable. But the courtroom had made something undeniable. Biology does not erase accountability. Blood does not cancel harm, and family does not excuse violence. 2 days later, my mother called. I let it ring twice before answering, bracing myself for another plea to protect him, another emotional trap disguised as concern. But her voice sounded different this time, thinner, unsure. "Claire," she said, "I am checking on you." Her tone carried something I had rarely heard from her. Deference, respect, fear of saying the wrong thing. "I am healing," I said, slowly. She inhaled deeply, the sound trembling across the receiver. "I want you to know I am trying to understand. I am reading what the police sent. I am talking to your aunt. I am trying." There was no request tucked inside her words, no plea for leniency, no demand that I consider the impact on Daniel. It was the closest thing to accountability I had ever heard from her. I appreciate that I said truthfully. But I need distance. I need space to figure out who I am without all of this. Without him. Without the expectations of being the peacekeeper. My mother exhaled again, resigned. "I understand. I do not like it. But I understand." After we hung up, I stood in the middle of my living room and let the quiet honesty of that moment wash over me. No contact was not just about Daniel. It was about everyone who had contributed to the system that allowed him to harm me without consequence for decades. Distance was necessary. Clarity required it. Therapy began the following week. My therapist, Dr. Layton, was soft-spoken but unwavering, the kind of person who could disarm you without raising her voice. In our first session, she asked me to describe the moment in the hallway before Daniel pulled the knife. I hesitated not because I could not remember, but because remembering required admitting that I had ignored dozens of earlier warnings. After I described the scene, she nodded slowly. Claire, she said your body reacted before your mind did. That happens when you have been trained to normalize danger. You learned to survive him long before you learned to question him. The statement felt like someone had placed a flashlight directly into the darkest corner of my life. For years, I had thought the problem was me, that I was dramatic, that I was sensitive, that I was overreacting. But I had not overreacted. I had survived. Every adjustment, every silence, every moment of shrinking had been survival. And now, for the first time, survival was no longer the goal. Healing was. Over the next month, I built a routine. Morning walks, therapy twice a week, journaling the fragments of memory I had pushed away for decades, cooking meals for myself, allowing friends to visit without feeling ashamed of my vulnerability. I also began the slow work of redefining family. My father called weekly, but with boundaries I set. My mother reached out sporadically, apologizing in small, clumsy steps. My aunt checked in with consistent warmth. And Daniel remained silent, not by choice, by order. Every day that passed without his presence felt like a thread unspooling from a net I had lived trapped inside. By the time sentencing approached, I felt stronger, but still fragile in places. Healing is not a straight line. It bends and circles, repeats and shifts. Some mornings I woke up angry. Other mornings I woke up grateful. Some nights the memories clawed at me. Others I slept peacefully for the first time in years. But every day moved me further away from the version of myself who had learned to stay small to survive, toward the version who could finally breathe without permission, toward the version who chose herself. No contact was no longer just a rule, it was a doorway, and I was already stepping through it. The morning of the sentencing hearing arrived with a quiet sharpness, the kind of cold that creeps beneath your clothes and demands you acknowledge it. I stood in front of my mirror longer than necessary, smoothing the fabric of my blazer, adjusting the small silver necklace I had worn to my rehearsal dinner just days before the attack. It felt strange reclaiming something from that night, as if I were weaving threads from a life that had been violently interrupted back into the person I was becoming. When I arrived at the courthouse, the air smelled faintly of winter rain. Natalie was already waiting at the steps, hands tucked into her coat pockets, eyes soft but steady. "You do not have to speak today unless you want to," she reminded me. "Victim statements are optional." "I know," I said, "but I think I want to." Emotional undulation pulsed lightly beneath my ribs. Not panic, not fear, but a fragile kind of resolve. Inside the courtroom, the room hummed with restrained tension. Ada Vega greeted me with a small nod before stepping toward the prosecution table. Daniel sat beside his attorney, looking hollowed out in a way that might have once sparked sympathy in me. But today, I felt nothing but clarity. The judge entered the bailiff called for order, and the proceeding began with a crisp recitation of the charges. Assault with a deadly weapon. Felony classification. Mandatory conditions. The judge turned to Daniel. "You have entered a plea of guilty. Before sentencing, the victim may address the court if she chooses." My heart thudded once hard as I rose. The courtroom blurred slightly at the edges, but my voice when it emerged was surprisingly steady. "Judge, I began the night my brother attacked me was supposed to be my wedding day." I paused, letting the truth settle, letting the weight of the words belong to the room rather than my chest. He did not ruin my wedding because the wedding did not get to happen, but he did try to ruin me. A ripple of stillness moved through the gallery. I continued. My entire life I was told to make myself smaller, to keep him calm, to give him space, to avoid provoking him. I thought that was normal. I thought that was family. My throat tightened, but I pushed through it. I thought that if I just managed him well enough, he would not hurt me. But he did. He chose to. And the danger I spent my whole life trying to prevent happened anyway. this time on the night I should have felt safest. I saw the judge's eyes soften. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. I am here today because the staff at my venue acted quickly, because law enforcement did their job, because the prosecutor believed me, because medical records do not lie, and because for the first time I stopped protecting someone who never protected me. My voice wavered on the last sentence, but not from weakness, from release. I turned slightly toward Daniel without fully facing him. You took something from me, but you are not going to take my future. Another quiet ripple spread across the room. When I sat down, my hands trembled, but my spine felt straighter than it had in months. The judge cleared his throat. Thank you, Ms. Hart. He reviewed the plea terms, then delivered sentencing with firm, even cadence. Felony conviction entered. 18 months supervised probation. Mandatory violence intervention program. Continued no contact order for 5 years. Mandatory therapy. Compliance monitoring. Violation will result in immediate incarceration. Daniel's shoulders collapsed slightly as the words struck him one by one, each syllable a consequence he never believed would touch him. But justice is patient, not absent, and it had finally arrived. When the hearing ended, people filed out quietly, their faces marked with something like respect, or maybe awakening. Outside the courthouse, the cold air wrapped around me again, but this time I felt insulated by something deeper than fabric. Something like truth. Something like freedom. Over the next year, life unfolded in small, deliberate steps. I returned to work part-time, easing into projects that did not overwhelm my healing nerves. Then slowly, I accepted more responsibilities, rediscovering the parts of myself that thrived in organization, creativity, and problem-solving. 6 months after the attack, my supervisor approached me gently. Claire, would you be open to taking on weddings again? For a moment, my breath caught not from fear, but from surprise. Weddings had been the place of my deepest betrayal, but also the space where I had once built joy for others. Maybe returning to that world could stitch something closed. Yes, I finally said. I think I would. My first event back was a small spring ceremony overlooking a lake. As I guided the bride to her position before the music began, she squeezed my hand and whispered, "Thank you for everything. You made this day feel easy." I smiled, a soft ache blooming inside me. Creating a beautiful moment for someone else did not reopen the wound. It healed something in ways I had not expected. In therapy, I continued unraveling the patterns I had been taught to call love. Dr. Layton guided me patiently, reminding me again and again that survival strategies are not character flaws. They are proof that I adapted to an unsafe world. And adapting is not weakness. It is resilience. My father remained present, gentler than I had ever known him, asking, instead of assuming, listening instead of excusing. My mother moved more slowly, but each month she stepped a bit closer toward accountability. Sometimes progress looked like a text saying, "I am learning." Other times it looked like an apology whispered through tears. Not perfect, but real. Daniel faded from my life entirely. The no-contact order held a clean boundary that transformed the landscape of my days. I no longer looked over my shoulder in parking lots. I no longer braced myself for phone calls. I no longer twisted myself into knots trying to predict which version of him I would face. No contact was freedom disguised as distance. A year after the attack, I stood in my small office arranging final details for another couple's wedding when I realized something quietly profound. I was not thinking about the assault, not thinking about Daniel, not thinking about the girl who believed endurance was the same thing as safety. I was thinking about flowers, seating charts lighting cues, and a future that felt wide instead of narrow. That realization filled my lungs like fresh air. My brother ruined my wedding, but he did not ruin my life. He took a day. I reclaimed every day after. And walking toward the window, watching the afternoon light spill across the floor, I understood something with a certainty that felt like peace. He never would. If you stayed with me through this entire journey, thank you. Stories like this are never easy to hear, yet they matter because they remind us of something many people learn far too late. Family is not defined by blood. It is defined by safety, by truth, by accountability, and by the courage to walk away when those things are denied. If you have ever been told to keep the peace at your own expense, if you have ever been pressured to stay quiet to protect someone else's comfort, or if you have ever been blamed for the harm someone else chose to inflict, then you already understand pieces of my story. And maybe, like me, you learned how to make yourself small to survive. But survival is not where your story ends. Healing begins the moment you decide that your safety and your voice matter more than someone else's excuses. So, tell me this. If you were in my place lying under hospital lights with a police officer standing beside your bed, and the truth finally too loud to ignore, would you still protect the person who put you there, or would you finally choose yourself? I want you to share your thoughts in the comments, not because the algorithm demands it, but because your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to hear tonight. And if you have a story of your own, whether you are ready to tell it or still finding the words, know this. You are not alone. You deserve safety. You deserve accountability. You deserve a life that is bigger than the pain someone else caused. If this story moved you, helped you, or gave you clarity about your own boundaries, tap the like button so more people who need strength, courage, or comfort can find this video. And if you want to hear more stories about resilience, justice, and what it looks like when toxic family patterns are finally confronted, subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next one. Every week we explore a new journey, a new voice, a new reminder that it is never too late to reclaim your life. For anyone healing from the aftermath of someone else's violence or manipulation, consider this your sign. You are allowed to choose peace. You are allowed to choose distance. You are allowed to build a future defined not by the harm behind you, but by the hope ahead. I rebuilt my life one truth at a time. You can too. Now tell me in the comments what part of this story stayed with you the most. The moment of betrayal, the moment of truth, or the moment of reclamation. I will be reading every comment.